Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. More than 250 economists call for trade reforms to allow capital controls. That may not sound that alarming, but in fact, if the U.S. government were to stop attempts to restrict capital controls, it would be more or less a revolution in how the U.S. government does business around the world. So in fact, it might be very important. Now joining us to talk about why all this matters is Sarah Anderson. She's a director of Global Economy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And Kevin Gallagher. Kevin is a professor of international relations at Boston University and a senior researcher at the Global Development and Environmental Institute at Tufts University. And along with Sarah, served on the U.S. Department of State's Investment Subcommittee. Thank you both for joining us. So
Thanks for having me.
So Sarah, start off. Why does this matter? Why are capital controls significant, and why are they restricted?
Yes, well, this might have been harder to explain to people a few years ago, but now people understand that financial crisis can be devastating for livelihoods around the world. And capital controls have been used effectively by many governments as one tool for dealing with financial instability. They help governments manage flows of short-term hot money across their borders, so they can be used to help prevent speculative bubbles. That's what Brazil is doing right now.
Okay, just back up one step. So what people call neoliberal economics, one of the features of it was, one thing is like privatizing state companies and other sorts of things, but one of the principles of applying free market economics around the world is capital should be able to come and go as it pleases, and government should stay out of the way.
Exactly.
And the U.S. government's been one of the pillars of support for this kind of practice.
Exactly. Together with the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. government has been pushing for decades to eliminate the use of capital controls, based on this view that the free market should always rule the international financial system. And what the statement that we're releasing, signed by all these hundreds of economists, shows is there's been a huge shift in the debate, with really a tremendous level of consensus that capital controls are a legitimate policy tool for dealing with financial instability.
So Kevin, give us an example of how this works and why it matters.
Well, there's a number of different tools that countries use to try to stem currency appreciation. Sarah mentioned Brazil. Brazil's currency is appreciated by about 40% since 2008. South Korea's currency is appreciated by about 35% since 2008. This is because, as Sarah said, short-term speculative capital is rushing into these countries and raising their currencies and causing asset bubbles. So what do countries try to do? They put in capital controls. They try to regulate the amount of foreign hot money that comes into the country. It takes different forms in different places. South Korea right now is just putting a firm quantitative limit on what foreign currencies can be used in South Korea.
So let's back up one step. So hot money. This is where you can borrow money cheap in the United States right now, and interest rates are much higher in Brazil and some of the other hot emerging economies. So you just take the money you borrow here and you lend it over there, and you make money on the spread, and that's what we're calling hot money. But and so what's wrong with that?
That's the biggest form of it right now. That's technically called the carry trade. We've got low interest rates in the U.S. to try to expand the economy and get out of this crisis. Interest rates are relatively higher, so you can borrow money in the U.S., park it in another currency, and make a very quick, significant return based on the interest rate differential.
So South Korea says, no. About that?
Go ahead.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it's not taking money and allowing it to be invested into productive economic use. This is speculation. This is mainly done by investment houses in Wall Street, London, and other places around the world. Right now, those low interest rates in the U.S. are intended to try to spur U.S. economic growth, spur U.S. Economic expansion and employment and so forth. But instead of doing that, it's causing money to fly out of the country and go into countries that can't handle the money. So it's not going to the productive use. The South Koreans want investment in new factories and employment-generating activities like that, as does the United States. But as long as you have an open system like this, money can be used for speculation rather than going into Main Street productive use.
Well, Sarah, why is this negative for Korea or for Brazil? Why wouldn't they want this inflow of capital?
Yeah. Well, what happens with bubbles is they pop, and then you have massive flight of capital out of the country, causing all kinds of instability. And we're living in a globalized financial system, and so crises like that, when there is a collapse in other countries, does come back to have effects in the U.S. as well. And so it's really in the U.S. interest to get rid of these outmoded policies and stop restricting the use of capital controls.
So, Kevin, if I understand it correctly, the reason why Brazil or South Korea doesn't like this is that it's inflationary. It starts driving up the value of their currency. Is that right?
That's right. And so their exports become more expensive and they can't compete in the world. They also can't get the handle that they would want to use to be able to stem inflation or asset bubbles at home. One of the things that you usually do to stem asset bubbles or inflation at home is raise the interest rate. But in a globalized environment, if you raise the interest rate, then you'll accentuate the amount of hot money that comes in because you've increased the carry spread.
Okay, so capital controls then, Brazil or Korea, would then somehow restrict this inflow of capital, but that would violate trade agreements they have with the United States. Is that the point?
That's the point. The United States, for decades now, has been outlawing the use of capital controls in their trade treaties. And these 250 economists that signed this said that this is inconsistent with economic thinking and practice, and U.S. trade policy should not be the mechanism for outdated financial policies.
So why is the United States, Sarah, why is the U.S. pushing countries not to have capital controls?
It's really hard to say when you have the IMF changing their position. They used to be completely opposed to capital controls. Today they're actually recommending them for certain countries. And so to have the U.S. actually making the IMF look like, you know, an enlightened progressive institution on this is hard to understand. We can only hope that the Obama administration is rethinking this issue and that moving forward we'll be negotiating new trade agreements that do not include this outmoded policy.
I mean, Kevin, as part of the issue here is just the power of American finance sector, that the American finance sector is very happy about casino capitalism. And they like this. They're the ones doing the hot money moves, and they have enormous influence in this administration.
Sure, that's absolutely right. It's been well documented about the composition of economic policymakers in the administration. But we should point out that the United States has not always had this vision about capital controls. Indeed, when Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes constructed the global financial system under Bretton Woods in the 1940s, capital controls were seen as an essential part of a stable financial system, and the United States advocated for them and even used them in the 1970s. That was part of a coalition between New Deal Democrats, industrialists, and laborers. But as those firms started to become more globalized and as Wall Street became a major global force, they, as you said, started to exert significant influence over U.S. policy, and the United States changed its course.
Sarah, both you and Kevin were on this advisors to the subcommittee of the U.S. State. Are they listening?
Well, we haven't seen the evidence yet. We were on a subcommittee that was stacked with representatives of big business, most of whom were really fighting any changes on these capital control policies. I will point
from the non-finance sector as well, like the industrial sector, were also
exactly
opposing it? Why would they be?
They also represent investors that want to move their money when they want to without any kind of government restrictions. And
so they're worried about any precedent, it might say.
Yes, exactly. Now, there are some interesting people in positions of power. Daniel Tarullo, who is an Obama appointee to the Federal Reserve Board, wrote a lot about this issue in the past. And he gave congressional testimony where he said that including these restrictions in our trade policies was bad trade policy, bad financial policy, and even bad foreign policy. Because what can happen if a government goes ahead and uses capital controls, private foreign investors can sue for compensation. So you can have a very sensitive situation with a country in crisis and U.S. investors potentially taking advantage of that and suing for compensation while that country's people are really suffering. So you do have some powerful voices close to the Obama administration out there. And like I say, we're just hoping that the statement we're releasing might help bring about a change of course on this.
Okay, we'll see whether it does and whether the Obama administration listens to you. Thanks for both of you very much for joining. And thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.